Let me check with Farhan. Farhan, are we good to go? It's
Yeah, I'm already
7:06.
I'm already streaming everywhere now. We are good to go, Naeem.
Yes, so then let me start the recording
Yeah.
also. I'll do that. Yeah. Okay, hi, hello, and good evening, everybody, or good morning, wherever you are. So, welcome to this 3 day night school, and we are quite happy, privileged to welcome you all to this 3 day night school. 3 day night school is much closer to Lama Khan because the conceptualization of night school started right at the inception of Lamakan itself, because we had a lengthy, in-depth night schools on the subjects like caste in India, feminism, gender sensitivity, Marxist ideology, and so on. So we keep doing night schools time and again, and this is the first occasion that we are doing night school uh, during the lockdown, and especially online format now. And for this night school, we had a lot of conversation that was happening for the last 3 months. So the whole conceiving of this planetary web of life has come because of being involved with Radha, and she curated the entire content, and she came up with this title, as well as the duration of the whole night school as well. So it's going to be 3 day, 3 consecutive days, I would call it. And today she's also going to brief you about what is this planetary web of life. And probably those who have not seen some of the links that we have shared on our website as well as on our Facebook page, please go through the content. She has given some suggested readings, and that would help you to comprehend the information that's going to roll out today. And apart from that, I think she's going to tell you about the planetary web of life, and then I will take the opportunity, and also I will take this honors to introduce Radha Gopalan to you. Uh, she has become a very dear friend now to us, especially to me, because we have been conversing, back and forth time and again for small things as well. So she keeps on, messaging me about anything and everything, and it has always become a very wonderful, sharing of information. And to those who do not know Radha Gopalan is a trained, environmental scientist, and she holds a PhD degree from IIT Bombay, and she has over 20 years of experience as an environmental consultant. And Radha has, pursued her long-standing, abiding passion for education, and that's why she has taken this leaps and bounds into, education. And she went to Madanapalli at the Rishi Valley School, and she taught there for 8 years. And she taught there sustainability and natural history, and to the high school students. And she was also deeply involved and engaged with the concept of food. So our early discussion was to have a night school on food. Then she said that merely food will not going to work out, because there are interconnected, interrelated things as such, and that's how this concept has come. And apart from that, she is also a member of Kudali, Intergenerational Learning Center, Telangana, and she is also a senior course designer with GenWise, and she works with the school children to strengthen the understanding of the interconnected of life on Earth. She is also a visiting faculty at Azim Premji University with the School of Development, and a lead faculty as an online course on sustainability in the Indian context. She is also one of the editorial board members of their science magazine called I Wonder. And apart from that, her hobbies include that she's a very staunch and avid yoga student practitioner, and she is also a teacher. In fact, she follows the tradition of BK Iyengars for the last 20 years. So I think with those few words, I would now like to welcome formally Dr. Radha Gopalan, and please join me in welcoming her. Thank you so very much, Radha, for this night school.
Thanks a lot, Nigh. And it's actually quite, it's a real pleasure, to be, and thanks to all of you for coming out for this 3-day night school. So a few disclaimers before I start. What I'm actually hoping to do is sort of not, me giving some information or talking about this, the whole idea of the Planetary Web of Life in the sense of giving information on the issue. But really, what I would like this to be is more of a dialogue where, I probably share a few points to anchor our discussion, and then after that, we could all, sort of collectively think about this and think this through a little bit. So that's really what I would like to do. And Naeem had said that, I would have about maybe 40 to 45 minutes to sort of share my thoughts, and then we'll have questions. And so what I will do is I'll use a set of slides because, one has a tendency to ramble, and I just want to make sure that I frame it in a sort of in a given context. And so just for that, I'm going to use a few slides, and then I'll probably, take about 35 to 40 minutes. And then after that, it's open to questions. So I think...
would you like to say a few words about how the 3 days are going to be unfolded?
Yeah, sure, Naeem. So as you can see, on the slide that I've projected at the moment, there are 3 paths to this whole dialogue, or what we could call it a dialogue on the Planetary Web of Life. The first one is really to look at the web of life from a systems perspective, really take a systems view of what life is. That would be, so it's sort of setting a framework today. And then tomorrow, I thought it might be useful for us to look at this framework in the context of our food systems. Given that, our food systems have, of course, it's a very critical part of our life, but given what we are facing today, particularly with the pandemic, and its very close connection with what we've done to our food system, I thought it would be useful for us to look at our food system in the context of this web of life approach. And finally, on the last day, we will try and see how we can build resilience, for a future where the planet, the Earth system, and the socio-ecological system that's a part of this Earth, how can we build resilience so that life can be sustained on the planet? So this is broadly how the 3 days have been laid out. It's flexible. There's a lot of, I'm hoping to sort of let it evolve over the next 3 days. Like I said earlier, I have a set of slides which I will just use as sort of points for us to engage in a dialogue. So Naeem, I have about 40 minutes. So it's about 7:15.
45 minutes, then we will open it up for a dialogue.
Fine. So it's about 7:15. I think I'll probably stop by about 7:50 or maybe before that even. Okay. So let's get started on today's discussion. Right. So now the first thing that I want to start off with is I'd like us to sort of look at various events that have been unfolding around us for a while, and I'm just going to go back maybe about 5-6 years. So for example, in India, we're looking at the Chennai floods in December 2015, Delhi, the smog of 2017, and successive years as well, and the floods in Kerala in 2018 August. And then of course India this burden of malnutrition, which is the triple burden, where on the one hand we have starvation, wasting, hunger, and on the other hand we have obesity, and then this very insidious problem of micronutrient deficiency, which is really one of the most significant issues that the country is facing. And then, of course, there was the Kisan March in March of 2018. So there are all of these events. There is a relationship, there is a causality that has been attributed. So now let's sort of look at some of the, what has been identified as causality. Okay. So we keep hearing about how, global warming-induced climate change is causing sort of extremely complex weather patterns, and so therefore extreme weather events. So that's one reason that's been attributed to some of these events, particularly the floods. And then there is also reclamation of coastal areas that's been happening because of the rampant development model or the growth model that we sort of adopted. So that is happening in order to facilitate this growth and development. We also have construction on river floodplains, which has been identified as a cause for the Chennai floods. The triple burden of malnutrition, its relationship with the agrarian crisis, and with the industrial food system. There's a lot that's been written about this relationship. And then, of course, when we talk about the smog in Delhi or even any of our metros, air pollution is a big part of the problem, is what we've been discussing, what has been out there in the media as well. And of course, a lot of smaller reasons have been attributed to the smog, particularly in Delhi. There's stubble burning in agricultural stubble burning in Punjab and Haryana, firecrackers during Diwali, and the vehicular emissions, construction dust, waste burning, etc., etc. So there's a whole bunch of sort of causes that have been attributed to the smog, as have been the list of sort of causes that I've just put down there seem to describe some of the other events that I was talking about earlier. So the agrarian crisis is at the heart of the Kisan March. Now, we look at some more events like these and again sort of look at the causality that has been attributed to many of these events. So let's take the Darfur crisis, right, in Sudan, or the conflict in Syria, and just the overall deepening inequalities all over the world. And then more over time, actually, historically, we've had epidemics and pandemics. And what is the causality? What are the relationships to many of the other events that are happening at a planetary level or at a country level or at a national level? So again, global warming induced climate change has been sort of put out there as a cause for many of the events that we observe, many of the phenomena that we observe. The Darfur crisis, people have talked about how religious fundamentalism was at the heart of the Darfur crisis. And of course, economic growth has been sort of a big causal agent for many of these things. The issue of enclosures, right? I mean, where land, water, resources, both physical resources as well as virtual resources, right? So the whole philosophy of enclosures, right? And also the industrial food systems all over again. So we keep reading, both scientific publications, non-scientific publications, and popular media. We keep seeing various causes attributed to various events, and they're sort of looked at in almost as discrete events. Okay, so I've listed a bunch of crises. I've talked about the Darfur crisis, the agrarian crisis in India, the conflict in Syria. So if we look at all of them, what I'm saying here is that these are not separate crises, right? They have emerged or they have happened fundamentally because of the change in our relationship with nature, and also because we attribute this kind of a binary, right? You have human, you have nature. So we keep talking about how the human-nature relationship has changed, and even in discussing this from an ecological perspective, we still talk about them as two entities: human society, human beings, and nature. So I want to just put that point out there. Now, what has been the dominant response to many of these causes that that I've sort of listed in the last couple of slides? So, if we look at global warming-induced climate change, which we all know, we are very aware, is one of the most daunting planetary crises that we're experiencing. So what is the dominant response? The dominant response is largely technology-based. So you have geoengineering solutions, renewable technologies, and then from a biodiversity or from the point of view of absorbing some of that carbon dioxide, which is in excess in the atmosphere, it's about plantations, it's about creating plantations. So these are the kind of responses that by and large have been put out there. And when it comes to extreme weather events such as floods, we're talking about, upgrading disaster management systems. We have, again, there are a whole host of technological solutions or technologies that have been put out there in the form of smart apps, largely engineering fixes. Again, some engineering fixes such as, desilting of water bodies would actually reduce floods. So most of these are strongly technology-based, right? And even when it comes to something like air pollution, and I've just taken a few examples here, just for us to get thinking about how we are approaching these issues, right? So we, particularly in the case of Delhi, it was, largely emergency measures, and we seem to be going from one emergency to another. So we had the odd-even traffic management, moratorium on construction, ban on firecrackers, and then things like, in order to shred all the crop residues, there was an introduction of happy cedar. So again, these were very specific firefighting emergency measures to deal with the immediacy of the air pollution. When it comes to things like conflict, okay, whether it is the Syrian conflict or whether it is threats to biodiversity, whether it is human-animal conflict or whether it is a conflict at the level of a nation where it is one country or within the country, different communities conflicting with each other. In both of these cases, what has been the dominant response? It's been militarized solutions. So for military, so when it is about a conflict within or between nations, then it is military solutions. If there are threats to biodiversity, there is militarized conservation, right, or national parks, and particularly, and this is very, very dominant, of course, we see it both in India as well as in various countries in Africa, right, where the military is called in to enclose, to fence, to prevent some and to allow some. Yeah? And of course, the issues of deepening inequalities, epidemics, pandemics, what has been the dominant response? It's always been the public becoming the private, right? And I was talking about enclosures earlier. It's about closing from some and closing against some, right? Closing for some and closing against some. And the other big thing, which we're also seeing now in the context of COVID-19, the pandemic epidemic situation, these are the responses are centralized and they are opaque, right? So we typically heading towards or already are a deeply surveillance state where, again, we go back to the technological aspects of it, through smart apps, through which you have to have on your machine in order to be able to cross borders. So the surveillance state phenomenon, right? And then the closing of the borders, protecting capital, right? And also, and in the case of the human-animal conflict, it's about culling animals. So there is a certain centralized response. And I just want to sort of spend a couple of minutes on the culling animals, and the reason I put it under this is because these kind of suggestions or these kind of actions are driven from a central from a central government. Like say, for example, in the case of culling animals, it comes from the Ministry of Environment and Forest, for example. So we're looking at these kind of one-size-fits-all sort of solutions, right? It's not about context-specific responses. And then, of course, there is medical intervention, which brings in big pharma, and the big battle that is ongoing, and we've always had this issue of open source versus private patent protection as a response to pandemics or epidemics, whether it is HIV or whether it is SARS-CoV-2. So these have really been the dominant responses to anything, any phenomenon, any event that has unfolded in the world. So just to put this together, what has been the nature of the response, right? The nature of the response is we are constantly treating the symptom, right? We're also firefighting, we're being reactive, whether it is against disease or whether it is against social inequality. whether there is whether we are dissenting against something or whether there is a disease, right? The response is always reactive and firefighting. Whether it's a natural, whether it's an event that is impacting natural systems or whether it's an event that's impacting social systems, right? This is the kind of response. The other thing that is interesting in the way we sort of respond to is we have this problems and solutions approach, right? You identify the problem and then we look for a solution. And invariably, technology is the solution to. So if we were to look at all of the problems or the events that I had sort of listed earlier, but everything is looked at. I mean, even the whole issue of global warming-induced climate change.
Apart from that,
But the problem is the climate change, and we're looking for solutions, right? And by and large, technological solutions, whether it is in the form of renewable energy, renewable technologies, or whether it is in the form of biological responses such as afforestation. And also, of course, another thing about the nature of our response is we're always looking for models. Say, for example, in the case of COVID-19, Kerala did a good job in India, right? So can we apply the Kerala model to other places? So we're always looking at models. We're looking to scale up these models. We're looking at replicating these models, and it is again about it again comes back to this whole centralized and this one size fits all, and if we found a solution to something, then it must be applicable somewhere else, and how can we apply it? So a lot of our resources, a lot of our energy is expended in this kind of an approach. So really, the metaphor that I always think about is, it's sort of we're missing the forest for the trees, and that's where we are at today, in a sort of that's kind of the dominant situation today, I would say, right? So I thought let's take a few minutes to look at can we understand the forest through the trees, okay? So like say, for example, if we were to look at the whole issue of, say, zoonosis, which is what we are facing today, which is the transfer of disease from animals to human beings, right? Whether it was SARS or whether it was the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome or H1N1, Ebola, Nipah, then the Typhoid forest disease, which was which really had impacted Kerala and Karnataka and the border areas quite a bit in the Western Ghat region, or whether it is COVID-19, right? All of these are zoonoses, right? And if we want to really sort of move the cobweb away and really look at what the issue there is, it is about industrial food systems, right? It is about habitat loss, and habitat loss is identified as the immediate sort of a cause, right? Because we're clearing forests, because we're clearing vegetation, because we're clearing habitats. As a result of that, there is a jumping of the virus from the animal system to the human system, right? But why are we clearing this? Why is this habitat loss happening? Why are we clearing these forests, right? Or why are we clearing this vegetation, or why are we clearing these ecosystems? We're doing it because our food system is a very strongly industrial food system. So in order to accommodate that industrial food system, we are sort of engaged in this whole process of habitat loss, which is then resulting in the manifestation of zoonosis. If we want to then look at global warming-induced climate change, right? If we look at the history of energy and we look at human civilization, I mean, there's such a close, it's sort of inextricably linked, right? The way we use energy has evolved over the time of human civilization. It's really about roti, kapda, and makan, right? And more than that. But it is really about how we feed ourselves, how we clothe ourselves, how we live, and then of course how we recreate and engage and entertain and so on and so forth. I mean, it's just the whole human existence, right? So when we talk about global warming-induced climate change, I mean, to sort of just relegate it to a single cause, or to sort of just look at it myopically in a sense, without placing it in the context of how we as a civilization have evolved, and without sort of tracing how we've been using energy and how that has incrementally and later exponentially impacted the levels of carbon dioxide and therefore average surface temperature in the earth. So it's so important for us to really sort of get to the root of the issue here. Again, we keep talking about mass extinction, and we relate that to global warming induced climate change, right? And then we have new sort of terms coined, the age of Anthropocene, right? So what is this age of Anthropocene, right? And I find it quite remarkable that the human mind is so interesting that, at a planetary level, and we talk about epochs and eras, and we occupy such a small sort of moment in time of the planet's existence, and we now call this the age of Anthropocene, right? So there has been a lot of discussion, both in scientific publications and in sort of non-scientific discussions as well, about the legitimacy of using this term Anthropocene, right? So now when we talk about the age of Anthropocene, what is it characterized by? It is characterized by consumption. So we really need to get to the root of the issue and understand that there is a relationship between consumption and mass extinction, between consumption, between the way we live, the way we use energy, and global warming induced climate change, relationship between all of this and the disease and the pandemics that we experience. And then, of course, we have what is termed as the success story, which was the ozone layer depletion, right? Where, there was global action where a lot of countries came together and successfully actually patched up the hole that was created in the ozone layer as a result of the use of a lot of chlorofluorocarbons, refrigerants, and fire material that goes into fire extinguishers, etc. So we had said that was a success story because we managed to reduce the hole over the hole in the ozone layer. However, periodically, and even quite recently, we've had instances where the stripping of the ozone layer actually went up again, right? So the thing is that the material that goes into fire extinguishers, the way we've sort of been looking at all of these phenomena, because we managed to reduce, we've sort of been looking at them as discrete events, which are problems and for which we need to find solutions, right? So now the question then is, who should respond, who responds, how do we respond, right, to all of these phenomena that have been unfolding around us for a long period of time. So we have several players that we talk about always. The state must respond this way, but this is a market-created phenomenon, or this is how the market should respond, or this is how we need to reshape markets, right? Then of course there's people and society, and then we place nature, right? We place nature also as an actor in this whole state, right? So then I come to these questions that we have to ask ourselves, right? Are these issues, where do you categorize these issues? Are they ecological? Are they economic? Social, cultural, political? I mean, how do you categorize all of the issues that we've talked about so far and that we've been experiencing here? And also, how do we know what these issues are? And maybe they're all of the above, or maybe they're not. Right? So how do we define these issues? And who should respond to these issues, and how should we respond to these issues? Right? Is it that there are specific actors who respond to specific issues? Or is there some other way that we should be responding? So now when we come to looking at, and now I'm sort of moving away from the whole issue of causality and relationships and all of that to response. So what I'm sort of putting forth there for our discussion is that let's begin to now move away from problems and solutions to understanding an issue and understanding response, right? Really, that's where we are now. So there's a bit of a shift in what I've been sharing with you. So now all of these, the crises and the conflict and all of that we've talked about, they're not sort of sudden events that have just emerged, right? We need to really begin to see them as processes, right? In a certain context. And again, the context is not a discrete context, right? It's a social, ecological, economic context. And so we really need to begin to understand these relationships. And so what I'm putting forth now for us to discuss is that can we look at this, can we take an ecosystems approach? Can we look at this can we look at life as a system? Yeah. So that's sort of, that's where we're sort of going at this point. Right? So one thing, there are numerous, there are numerous ways of looking at life as a system. But one sort of approach that Fritjof Capra and a bunch of other scientists have been talking about for quite a while, which I found very interesting and which I have used a fair bit in discussions both with children and with adults, is for us to really think about this idea of nested systems, where we as individuals are, within a household, within an economics, which is within a larger economic system, social system, ecological system, and then the earth system. And then, of course, one could even definitely keep expanding towards the universe as well. But for our discussions and for the purposes of our thinking, if we were to sort of look at, and since our discussion is about the planetary web, if we were to stay with the Earth system. So if we were to look at this as this idea of nested systems, right? And within these nested systems, if we were to say that really life is about how it's about this network of relationships that exists between these various systems and within each of these systems. Okay, if we were to think about it like that. If we were also to look at it in the form of patterns and organizations, right? If we were to look at, and we're drawing from this whole idea of the ecosystem, we're drawing from this whole idea of the natural system of how it exists, right? Where in nature, in natural systems and in nature, we are constantly seeing patterns. We're seeing rhythms and cycles, right from very simple a diurnal cycle to much more detailed cycling of elements, cycling of material, the flow of energy, the flow of nutrients, the rhythms of life, whether it's fruiting, flowering of plants, whether it is migration of birds, whether it is hibernation or aestivation of animals, whether it's responses of that kind to changes in the environment around. It's all about these networks of relationships with cycles and rhythms and fluxes built in. And over and above all of this, we also have a whole, the way natural systems respond to change is through this whole process of feedback loops. When there is a change, when there is a change in a system, there is a response, and that leads to a different condition of the system, which leads to another change. And then the response is in response, and whatever change happens after that is in response to that change. So there is this whole idea of, and none of this, none of what I'm saying is new at all, of course, because I know a lot of you are familiar with all of these. But what I'm putting out there is for us to sort of think about the way, to think about the events that are happening around us through this understanding of natural systems where we have these networks of relationships and patterns and rhythms and cycles. And there's also a whole bunch of hidden connections that we don't understand. And these emerge periodically when an event unfolds itself in the world. Like, for example, the most recent one, which is the pandemic. And there are a whole bunch of connections that are now emerging, whether it is in the cause or whether it's in the response, right? The way we respond leads to changes which were never fabricated, right? And of course, like I said earlier, there are interdependencies both within and across systems. So now I'm just going to quickly I know these are very what do I call it? There's not much clarity in these figures, but the figures are being used not so much for us to go into the details of the figures, but to sort of say that we are all familiar with these figures. We've seen it in our science textbooks. We're taught about natural cycles. We're taught about the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the sulfur cycle, phosphorus cycle, and we've talked about them as separate cycles, and we draw them in our notebooks and textbooks, and children study them day in and day out as part of ecology or biology, right? We also know about food webs and the intricate connections between and each ecosystem having its own set of intricate connections and complex relationships of food. And then there's this really lovely picture that appealed to me tremendously, which is the one of the wood wide web, which is the more recent understanding of how trees communicate through a network of fungi in the soil, and how these mycorrhiza, which is the network of fungi, how they communicate, how the chemical communication happens between trees, and which we are increasingly beginning to understand. And this is what I was talking about when I said hidden connections. So there's a constant unfolding of these hidden connections of natural systems that we are learning about. They always existed, but human intelligence is now slowly beginning to understand some of this. So so there is this absolutely rich and complex relationship that exists there. Now, most of the time when we study these cycles, and when we study them in school as biogeochemical cycles or in university, we study them as discrete cycles, right? Like I was saying earlier. But if you were to really take even one phenomenon, right, like the global warming-induced climate change, if you were to just take that one, and this is a very simplistic representation. We're talking about the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. And both of these are strongly interrelated, right? But we never really study them in this manner at a school level or even often at a university level. And often, of course, it completely sort of steps away from our even our consciousness at one level as we start moving into higher education often. So here, for example, when we're talking about global warming and we're talking about climate change, so when you have land use change, you have fossil fuel burning, it is impacting the carbon cycle, but it's also impacting the nitrogen cycle. It's changing the balance of carbon and nitrogen. And there is an internal interrelationship between the two, which is so important for our food systems, which is so important for life on Earth. This interrelationship, right? And what is very interesting is that even in 1997, when studies were done by Vitusek and his team, it was very clear that by 2030, the amount of nitrogen that human activities, in that whole nitrogen cycle, the amount of nitrogen that's going to be fixed by human activities will exceed that fixed by microbial processes. So what we're doing is this balance of nitrogen that's being maintained by this cycling. So cycling itself denotes a certain kind of balance that's maintained, right? So when we begin to interrupt the flows, when we begin to change these flows and we begin to interrupt these cycles, and we begin as human activities begin to influence these cycles, there is a problem. Right? And we see a manifestation of that problem in the form of climate change or the innumerable other changes that we're experiencing on the planet. So these are again those connections that we were talking about earlier. So going forward, so one of the things that is being suggested for our discussion is, can we sort of look at life as a web of network relationships, and that if we understand that life is this web of network relationships, which is in cycles and rhythms and patterns with interrelationships across and within systems and subsystems, then that allows us to think about how do we bring about resilience, or how do we maintain resilience, right? Can we repair the tear in the web, without creating another tear? How do we do that, right? And also, like I said earlier, can we see changes as conditions and responses? but rather than as problems and solutions, which drives a very myopic and a very one-dimensional sort of approach to really understanding something so complex, right? And this is where I'm sort of going to stop for our discussion and questions, etc. But I just want to put it out there that tomorrow's session we'll look at the food, our food system in the context of this relationships and the systems view. And I thought this would be a good point for us to have a discussion where the ecologist and biologist Richard Levins and Levins in both says this so well in the book The Dialectical Biologist. With that, the world is constantly in motion, right? The constants become variables, causes become effects, and systems develop, destroying the conditions that gave rise to them. So it's really, so important for us to think about. And I look at this statement, and every time I look at this statement, I think there is so much in this for us to sort of understand and really begin to go a little deeper into this whole system of relationships and how this change what we see as discrete events and as problems and solutions are actually so much more complex. So I'm actually going to stop right here, and I'm going to come out of the presenting mode because I don't think we need slides anymore. And Nigh, how do you want to do this? Do you want to sort of what are the questions or?
Right. I mean, the whole idea behind night school is to have a dialogue and in-depth analysis.
Right.
Since you already, set the tone,
Yeah.
I think the ball can be rolling now. There are people who have actually put up. I think Devika has, put a question in the chat box.
Yeah.
You can
I'll take
respond.
that. Sure. Yeah. So what is the extent of damage? So Devika, you're saying what's the extent of damage that human activities has caused to the ecological balance? Can you share the percent? I can actually share some, I can share references that you can go through, because when we talk about the damage that human activities has caused, there is some really good research that has been done. But again, remember, most of these are estimates, okay, and most of them are outputs of models. And when we talk about the damage that human activities has caused, now ecological balance is such a vast thing, right? And here I'd like to sort of get us to look at, there's this very interesting model that Rockstrom and his team from Sweden have put out, which they call the Planetary Boundaries. And in those planetary boundaries, there are very specific parameters that they've put out there, which includes, of course, biodiversity, which includes the nitrogen balance, which includes climate change, etc., etc. So I can point you to that reference, because that would be a really good reference for you to get a sense of it, get an understanding of what we mean by ecological balance, because it's such a loaded word, ecological balance. So yeah, but I will share that with you for sure. Yeah. In fact, I can sort of maybe put it out tomorrow as well. Yeah. So yeah, people, please feel free to, it's a dialogue. I mean, I just put things out there for us to discuss. So
they are still feeling that they are in school, where the teacher only tells and the people will listen to it. The children will only listen.
No, we've got a bunch of people who are not at that point in life, I know. So it'll be nice to have a conversation. Yeah.
So, could you just highlight about, the system approach has always
okay,
failed.
so we've got a bunch of, okay, so we've got one where Vedant, is that Vedant? Yeah. A lot of nature forests have been lost. How many real forests are left? Countries are foresting commercial trees. What's the impact? Okay, that's interesting. So yes, a lot of native. Now again, this definition of forest is very tricky, right? So what do we mean by native forests? Are there really any native forests? But when we talk about forests, right, we're talking about an ecosystem. Okay, so it's very difficult to say how many real forests are left. Now, for example, even something like the Amazon, or when you look at the Western Ghats, or when you look at Southeast Asia, There are a lot of, there are very rich biodiverse forest ecosystems there, right? There are. But it's very difficult to, it's really very difficult at this point to say how many of them are native forests, because a lot, unfortunately, the human ability to navigate, the remotest corners of the earth has meant that not just today, but even indigenous communities, has meant that there are a lot of forest ecosystems or forests where human beings have gone, right? Now, having said that, countries are foresting commercial trees. Now, that's a very interesting point, because today there is this whole, Born plan that is being put out there saying that, if we were to just replace, so what if we're clearing forests for, cultivation of food, right? So what if we're clearing forests for fodder for cattle, right? We can always grow trees. Like for example, the whole carbon market, carbon trading that was happening around climate change is built around this thing that, so what if we clear forests? We can always plant them, but you can't, because you cannot recreate that ecosystem. Those interconnections that I was talking about. Let me give you the example of trees which are communicating through mycorrhiza, through fungi in their roots, right? So you have that relationship which you cannot recreate. So you really cannot recreate that forest ecosystem, the way it absorbs carbon dioxide, the lives that it supports. So you cannot recreate that. So therefore, the big impact of clearing and foresting commercial trees is that you have destroyed a large number of ecosystems, which means that you are impacting very fundamental parameters that control and regulate life on Earth. So if we were to even take the whole climate change thing, right? Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, this whole cycling of carbon that I was talking about, the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are deeply impacted when you clear what you're calling as real forests or native forests and replace them with a commercial forest, because the abilities, and very recently there was a very interesting paper where they compared how much carbon could be fixed by a plantation versus what is called a native forest. So the impact is huge. Yeah, absolutely. So Vedant, if you have a follow-up question, we can take that for sure. Shayantini, so what are your thoughts on humans on an individual and collective level being open systems themselves, and how that reality is reflected in systems like climate change? Yes, that's an interesting point, Shayantini. So when we're talking about being open systems themselves, so there are two ways of looking at it, right? One is thermodynamically looking at it as an open system or a closed system. And the other way is to look at it socio-ecologically as well, right? Now, when I wanted some clarity from you on what you meant by open systems, right? So I'm trying to understand the context in which you said open systems. Is it about the interrelationships between the individual and the collective? Are you referring to that?
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Okay, yeah. So, while the collective is critical at many levels, right? It's critical for decision making. It's critical for response. It's critical for the way we, as citizens, respond to changes, or we put pressure on governance, the way we govern, the way we take on stewardship as opposed to ownership, right? So when we talk about the collective, then there is this whole issue of the commons that comes in as well, right? We're talking about, arriving at accommodations and negotiations in order to be able to protect ecosystems, or to be able to maintain integrity and balance of ecosystems, socio-ecological systems, right? So that is the strength of the collective, and that's the interrelationship between them, right? But and how that realities of reflection systems. So in climate change, it's because there's a lot of studies that have been done by psychologists on how human beings are responding to climate change. Why is it that there's so much hesitation, and why is there so much what should I call it? Sort of almost denial, right, in climate change, and also to think about it being somewhere out there, not in our lives. So the collective becomes very important in these cases because you also put pressure on each other, but you also dialogue around how you can create change. And change is, while individuals can create change to some extent, but the collective change and the collective pushing governance systems to change, that becomes very important in climate change. That becomes very important in taking action towards climate change, because a lot of actions that are necessary to be taken for, to mitigate global warming induced climate change are, while some of it is at an individual level, but a lot of it is political and policy changes that are required. A lot of it is market changes that are required, right? So I think this is where I'm hoping, Shantini, that some of your some dimension of your question was sort of discussed.
It has, yeah, thank you.
Not at all, not at all. Not
I
at
am
all.
working on the psychological side of this,
Oh,
to
okay.
how
Okay.
people respond to climate change. So I will
Yeah.
most probably have a lot more questions for you over the
Sure. And also, I will send you there's a really wonderful set of papers available on this, on climate change. And, Michael Hume has done some really, really good work on that. So I can send you the reference as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
No, not at all. Yeah. Sarayu, how do we think or rethink about technological advancement or development and ecological balance at the same time? Yeah, that's an interesting one. Now, when we talk about technological advancement or development, as you put it in apostrophes, the thing is that the way I see it is technological advancement. Like, these are all responses, right? We're responding to some change, right? So when we talk about development, first and foremost, it's it's the age-old question of development for whom, development for what is this development that we're talking about, right? And also to completely question, which of course a lot of people have been doing for a long time, is this idea of capitalism and of course recently, in the last 3 months, I know there have been a whole bunch of papers challenging, both from scientists, natural scientists as well as social scientists have always sort of engaged in the debate, but natural scientists, ecologists, physicists, chemists, etc., coming out with arguments and publications where looking at this whole issue of the capitalist society. And there was one reference that I had sent as part of the 3 readings that I had suggested. And Sarayu, you should really look at that paper from Nature. It completely goes into very, very great detail about the role of capitalism, affluent consumption, and how it's impacting not just climate change, but zoonosis and the issue of the pandemic as well. Okay, to sort of, in a nutshell, to tell you, and we'll talk a little bit more about it on the 3rd day, but in a nutshell, to sort of say that really at the heart of, in this whole debate of ecological degradation, even way before we discussed climate change, the whole issue of ecological degradation, the big thing was about population. So there were all these theories about the population bomb, that this was responsible for, it was because of the developing countries which have high populations, which is why nature is sort of stretched to its limits. And ecosystem balances are being, or ecological balances are being impacted. But when increasingly, of course, we've all begun to understand that it is really, while population is an issue, it is about consumption, right? It's about, and who is consuming the most, right? There is a whole section of society, whether it's in India or whether it is outside of India. Within India, it is sections of society where the consumption is way beyond any measure of requirement. And then globally, of course, we have large societies who are consuming way more than is required for them. And as a result of which, of course, there are other manifestations of overconsumption. So it's really the argument about capitalism is really about this push towards consumption, and that too affluent consumption, right? So what affluent consumption is doing is it's threefold. So one is that the affluent are consuming in a way which in itself is destroying ecosystems and natural resources, then they are also in positions of power and they're holders of capital, as a result of which they're driving the whole capitalist economy, which again is the next stage. And then the third stage is by setting certain so-called norms and aspirational standards or aspirational needs, right? They drive everybody else towards that level of consumption. So these are the three arguments that are being put forth in that paper. So I have a feeling, Sarayu, you might really enjoy looking at that paper, and it might sort of give you even more points to think about. And as far as technological advance is concerned, technology has always been touted as the panacea to all problems, right? It is the solution. However, more often than not, we fail to see that technology is only part of the response. It's only part of what is called a solution. There are social responses, there are cultural responses, there are economic responses, there are political responses. And technological is just one part of that overall response. So unless we understand relationship and unless we understand all of these cycles and flows and exchanges and interconnections that we were talking about earlier, we are going to constantly be responding in this sort of myopic sort of way. Yeah, so that was Sarayu. So Sarayu, I think that's the beginning of another long conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I'll check out the article that you shared.
Yeah, please. Yeah, that'd be nice. And then we can talk a little bit more about it tomorrow or day after as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I'm just going to read out some of the questions that have come on the YouTube channel.
Sure.
We also have a live streaming going on.
Sure.
This is by Black Eyes, and according to this person, do indigenous systems, example North American Indians, Australian Aboriginal, our own Indian forest dwellers, have the concept of web of life?
Oh yes, great question, because you're going to see it tomorrow. I've actually taken an indigenous, not tomorrow, day after, sorry. But then let me respond to you. Oh, absolutely. The web of life is at the heart of their understanding. And this is what I was going to come to on the third day, where we're talking about resilience, is that, it's not new to human thinking. It's just that we have moved so far away from that understanding that we're now beginning to look at it differently. It is not new to human thinking. Now, mainstream science or what we call industrial education or mainstream science, you can call it either of the two, is beginning to understand that. And then, of course, everybody's leaping towards indigenous communities now and saying, oh, we need to really, they are our teachers. But the point is, there is a fundamental transformation required if you're looking at learning from indigenous communities. Oh yes, web of life is very central to their existence, whether it is Adivasi communities, whether it is the Latin American communities or Aboriginals, all of the communities that you talked about. Absolutely. Yes. So Naeem, is there another one, or shall we look at Madhuri's?
You can go to the other questions in the chat.
Yeah, okay. So Madhuri said, what would be the probable impacts of increasing the amount of industrial and anthropogenic nitrogen fixation? Okay, so that's an interesting question there. So the thing is that, when the nitrogen balance changes, right? So you will invariably have more nitrogen available in soil, right? And if there's more nitrogen available in the soil, then there is a washout of that nitrogen into water bodies and leading to eutrophication, leading to extensive contamination of water bodies, which in turn impacts, and you've seen it in you've seen it in all the lakes and ponds all over our cities, where you have growth of plants, aquatic plants. You have growth of particularly things like water hyacinth, or you have these films of algae and plant growth, which have grown as a result of this excessive nitrogen that has come from the fields onto, or come from the soil into the water bodies. Now, as a result of which the oxygen in the water bodies gets cut out. If the oxygen gets cut out, then you don't have, then it impacts other life forms in the water bodies. And if it impacts other life forms, then we are completely affecting the entire food web and ecosystem there. So that's really one of the examples of what happens when the nitrogen balance gets impacted. There's also another example that's related to climate change. When we shift this nitrogen balance, there is a release of oxides of nitrogen, some of which are global warming gases. So Madhuri, there's a very strong interconnection here between the nitrogen and the carbon cycle. Yeah. We can come back to more questions, Madhuri, if you have later. So then we have two questions from Shanta. Okay. How about the fact that we as a species have not yet discovered important yet subtle interactions like the fungi trading energy and nutrients with the trees? Yes, the fungal bodies fetching micronutrients and consuming the sugars from the roots. Many of these processes are only just being recognized. Very, very true. And as a result of which, right, we have to be so careful in how we engage with natural systems. We have to be so careful in how, because we don't know. We really don't know a lot, right? So, for example, in this particular case, if you were to indiscriminately fell trees, right? If you were to, without this understanding, if you were to clear forests, which is what is happening, and if you were to replant, right? This understanding will inform what you can clear and what you cannot. Because in the study, they found this relationship between the older trees and the younger trees, and that, you know, in some situations, because people were cutting down older trees for timber, in some cases, there was a communication between the older trees to the younger trees, which actually regulated the hormonal development in the younger trees in such an interesting fashion that the younger trees did not, their growth was retarded. So they did not reach that maturity at which point they would be cut for timber books. So it's a very interesting evolutionary understanding as well. So yeah, I mean, you know, this sort of understanding really also allows us to be so much more cognizant of what we are doing, and also to, if we have to clear certain areas, how do you think about this? How do you think about what trees to plant where? If you have an understanding of this kind, it can be such a, I mean, our interventions can be so much more meaningful. Our engagements can be so much more meaningful. Yes. There's another question here. Yeah. So I'll just finish with Shanta. Are there any recently found interactions that will revise our understanding of ecology? Yeah, I mean, this tree one is a very important one. But also, you know, increasingly we are finding new species of animals, whether it's amphibians or whether it is reptiles or whether it's butterflies, insects, whatever. So we are increasingly finding newer and newer species. We're also finding modifications of modifications of existing species. And if you get into the microbial world, you know, we're beginning to understand so many more interactions. Like, say, for example, this whole thing, and I keep coming back to COVID-19 because it's so strong in our consciousness, right? But this whole relationship that we see here of what is happening between microorganisms and other animals, or the fact that, you know, when animals live in close proximity with each other, what happens and how microorganisms are jumping from one host to the other. So these are all understandings that we are gleaning more and more recently as we experience more and more phenomena. Yeah.
Here is a comment come question on Facebook Live.
Okay.
This is by a friend called Sanjay Gadale.
Okay.
And according to him, what's all this confusion being created by vested interest is deliberately misinterpreting AI to keep the issue in confusion as a process is compromised to yield an assessment that is obviously flawed to meet the ends of a few vested interests. How do we handle this behavioral issue of extreme ignorance and arrogance?
That's a question that we all have to think about, because that's I mean, how do you handle it? I don't know, really. It's about, see, first and foremost, The biggest problem is, of course, there is a certain arrogance that we have, that we understand everything. Yeah, that we understand natural systems, we understand how that we are still, and of course, at the heart of this whole behavior is that we have control over nature. Now, for example, you take even our current approach, just overall, globally, to the pandemic. We're talking about the war against the pandemic. We're talking about the vocabulary that is being used as well, right? The vocabulary that's being used is a very militaristic and this is a natural system. I mean, this is a virus, right? Without appreciating the fact that this virus has sort of, I mean, it's this tiny microscopic creature which has stopped life as we know it. Okay, so the arrogance comes from the fact that you have completely alienated yourself from natural systems. I mean, that's how I see it. And so, in order for that arrogance to be even, to be even addressed or responded to, we have to find ways by which we can re-establish that relationship, which is why I strongly feel that it's at the level of education, that it's at the level of, like, for example, even with children, right? We have this whole, because of the society that they're growing up in, the disconnect between children and their surrounding environment is so strong that even their vocabulary has changed. So it's a very, I mean, it's an existential question that you're asking, you know. So if there are other folks on the discussion who have, other perspectives, it would be really interesting. I mean, this is, I think, it is at the heart of what is happening in the world, really. So there is no straight answer. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's sort of what I was arriving at.
Yeah, that's true.
But it's a very, very important point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Nigh.
Yeah. There is another thing to add more. Or yeah, Ravi is saying yes. You can go.
Yes, Ravi. Yes.
I want to know that what sort of measures can be taken so that the awareness will be inculcated.
Yeah. You are talking about
at ground level, even if there is no policy support from government or any other organization.
Right. So there are. So one is, of course, at the level of education. I mean, the only real way out there is through education. But when you're talking about education, I'm not talking about the formal school education. That too has to be dealt with. But really, at education at a very different level of the community, at the level of when we talk about education, we're always thinking about the formal education system, but really more at the level of dialoguing and at a community level, at the level of even within families, to really begin to question and try and understand everything. I mean, something very simple, Ravi, it would be if you were to just look at your food, right? Where does my food come from? Even if you were to ask yourself that question and try and trace it back. Okay, if you were to do it as a family, it's fascinating what it reveals. And then it creates, because you begin to become sensitive to where your food is coming from, how it's being cultivated, how it comes to you. And we've all experienced it during the lockdown. We really have understood this whole crisis of food. So if you were to ask, if you were to do even something as small as this, you begin to appreciate and understand rather than trying to understand it at an intellectual level. So Ravi, education is at many levels that we're talking about. Does that make sense? Does it? I mean, is that something that you would think about, or if you had a follow-up on it? And while you are coming back to me, I'll look at some of the other questions. I think there's Devika, right? I think I have it. What kind of social intervention is possible now to repair the system? We're encouraging people to plant trees, but will that solely help? Well, again, planting trees is it's a double-edged sword. It's really a double-edged sword, because you have to, like we just talked about, we have to understand the relationship between. We have to really understand more, which means we have to very actively engage in equipping ourselves with this kind of an understanding. But more so, when we talk about social intervention on repairing the system, I would say we need to first begin to even question. You know, Devika, I mean, we are not even questioning, even the simple question that I was just telling Ravi, where does my food come from, right? How does water get to my taps? Right? We don't even, we're not even aware. So the first, and even before we become aware, it's about observation. So are we even looking around to see what's happening around us, right? There's the observation of the senses. And then once you start observing, you become aware. And once you start becoming aware, you become sensitive and then you take action. So it's really, when we talk about social intervention, it's not about somebody coming into a system and trying to create change, right? It's about the change happening within, which means the first step is to understand where I am, where am I? How am I living my life, right? And when we do this collectively, and we've done this a lot with some of the groups, and one of the groups that I'm engaged in very deeply is the Kudali Intergenerational Center, where a lot of this kind of engagement through popular education is being done, where you are in your community, and you are raising these questions, and you're trying to understand where am I, where am I in terms of how do I respond to my needs, where am I in terms of my food, where am I in terms of my shelter, my clothing, where am I in terms of my relationships with people, and then trying to understand that. So it's a socio-ecological, economic, so it's this whole interconnected thing, and to really look at it as these, again, going back set of relationships. So encouraging people to plant trees, yes, I mean, that's one action, right? But but then the question is, why do I want to plant trees? What should I plant? Where should I plant, right? So these are, so it actually, it's not that straightforward an answer, unfortunately, like none of these answers are. Shantani, yes, sure, yeah, you can pick whatever there is of my brain, definitely. Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So, if I'm allowed to ask, then I was just thinking, most of the systems approach tend to fail, and there is no, a quick fix or a fixed solution per se.
Yeah.
So how do we get rid of this systems approach and get into changing our situation rather than, trying to find a solution? So
yeah, but you're right. I mean, the thing is that, first, in order to, again, finding a solution is very difficult, because when there is a change around you and you respond to that change, you have a new condition and you have to respond to that. So it's like this journey that you keep going on, right? But in order to even respond, Nigh, you have to first understand the situation you're in, right? Okay, so like say, let's take this very, I keep coming back to food because we're going to be looking at it tomorrow, right? So, or even water. Okay, let's take even something like water, right? So if we don't understand how water gets to our house, right? When there is, and people are telling you have to conserve water, We tell our kids, we tell everybody, conserve water, don't leave the tap open, etc., etc. Why? I don't even understand. You're telling me, so I'm doing it, but I'm not questioning that. I'm not beginning to understand, why is this such a big issue? Like say, for example, I live in Kerala. A lot of people, Kerala gets so much rain and we have so much water. Why should we even bother? Or I've had kids in school ask me this question, that if I can afford to pay my water bills, why should I conserve water? Right? But then we need to understand that it's from a larger pool that we are drawing this water. That if I don't do this, then somebody else is not getting that water. Right? So how am I linked to somebody else? So there's this whole need. So this is, how do we bring about this transformation? Now, in order to bring about this transformation, we first have to become aware of where we are today, right? Without that awareness, it's very difficult, because then it's cosmetic and we bring it in from the outside.
Do you think that civilization has played a role in this, equity and inequity, so-called, inequality and so on? So, yeah, how do we look at that, equity, inequity, and inequality?
See, I mean, it's also about, when we talk about inequity and inequality, it's about how the redistribution of resources, right? I mean, it fundamentally comes down to this whole issue of ownership and private property, and the idea of shared access to resource, right? That understanding, okay, which existed, which, not that it didn't exist, of course it existed, but then we adopted an economic system, or we sort of, and again, all these economic systems are all constructs of society. We adopted an economic system which is mainstream. I mean, there are still so many communities that don't do this. I mean, there are so many instances and examples of communities that live very differently, right? But we have chosen to adopt this mainstream system of, ownership, or sort of how we engage with the resources, and how we sort of our socio-economic system. We've chosen this particular system, and so along with it comes all of this, right?
Or also the systems that have come over a period of time. We have been experimenting. Like
Exactly.
we talk about the resources.
Yes.
There is a political system which controls the distribution of the resources.
Exactly. It's about power, right?
So are we going to change the system and bring or replace a new system which is also going to be, maybe less exploitative, but there is going to be some kind of exploitation as such?
The thing is, though, why should there be one form of system for the entire world, right? Why can't we have context-specific systems that have evolved for a given context, right? What works for one context, socio-ecological context, does not work for another one.
Right.
Right? So the question is, that's the larger question, isn't it?
Yeah.
As a human species, are we sort of ready to get onto that? And there are societies, there are situations where people are doing that, right? I mean, there are communities that are doing that, where there are contexts where the exchanges, where the economic or the socio-economic systems have evolved for that particular context.
So do you find the very formative, years of the human evolution had some problems of usurping the resources? So there is some innate quality that they actually have. It's also behavioral problem rather than just the socio-economic, political, or ecological problem as such.
I mean, you're human beings, right? So when we say socio-economic, ecological, it's cultural. It is the human. It's what we were just talking about earlier. Shayantini and was saying about it's the psychology. It is emotional. It is cultural. It's social. It's all of it, right? And so it's very difficult to separate that, because you get into this treadmill that you sort of keep rolling along without re-examining or examining or even bothering to sort of look at where you are, right? And then the destruction, and then the sort of the conversation becomes abstract after that. So how do you ground it in reality? That's very important. And so the grounding in reality then comes from us examining ourselves, us examining our food system, us examining the way we are building our houses, the way we are designing our cities, right? So, and this is where social movements play a huge role. This is where citizenry and democratic approaches, the freedom to, and it all comes back to all of the things that are increasingly being threatened, right? This is whether it's dissent or whether it's questioning, right? So it really comes back to that of constant re-examination as a society. And unless that happens, it's, isn't it? Yeah.
There is one more in the chat box, I think.
Okay. Let me just look at that. Durga, okay. The question of networking of rivers has differing answers from science communities themselves. How do we resolve and take the ecologically viable solution? Absolutely, yes. So this whole issue of networking of rivers, right? Yeah, that's a very, very contentious project, right? So it has, it's got huge ecological, it's got social and economic implications. Now resolving it has to happen through, there are a lot of groups that have been involved in this whole process of examining this project on networking of rivers. And from an engineering perspective, from an ecological perspective, from from an economic perspective, arguments have been put forward. But it's not just that we want an ecologically viable solution, Durga. We also want, I hate using this word sustainable, but what I'm trying to say here is we want a solution, or we're looking at a response that is sustainable. That means it is ecologically, economically, socially, culturally viable. Okay, so that is important. Because we are a socio-ecological system. The planet is a socio-ecological system. So we have to look at balancing all of this, and it is a trade-off. So what is that trade-off? And where is that trade-off? And how is that trade-off different in different contexts? Right? The trade-off can be different in certain locations. Like say, for example, if you're interlinking the Ganga with some of its other tributaries, or if you're interlinking rivers in the south, the contexts are different, right? So, so therefore the approaches have to be different. But interlinking rivers per se, okay, has a huge number of problems. It's a very superficial approach that is being adopted, which is that, because there is drought here, so we are bringing water. But that whole ecosystem has evolved to those conditions. By bringing water into a dryland area or a semi-arid area, you are actually going to completely change the local ecology, which is going to impact the social and socio-economic system and the cultural systems. Because we don't place any value on different kinds of ecosystems. Right? You have the desert ecosystem, you have the semi-arid, you have the tropical ecosystems. Each of them have their uniqueness, and each of them have life systems which have evolved there. Right? So we're only looking at abundance of water, and that's not necessarily an ecologically, socially, culturally viable solution at all. Okay, so is it really possible to understand all the interconnections before we can take action? This is required by the scientific method versus the intuitive understanding of indigenous communities requiring no proof. Yes, Durga, the thing is, most of us have evolved in this whole modern scientific educational system. So we're actually, I'm not sure how many of us retain that intuition. A lot of indigenous communities, experiential knowledge, lived experience, has led to a certain understanding and a way of being with the surrounding environment, right? With their social systems and their cultural systems have evolved to that ecological system. And so that intuitive understanding and the accommodations, so they have also engaged in trade-offs. They have also engaged in accommodations and arrangements which allow them to exist and coexist with natural systems there. Okay? They are very, very sophisticated systems have been put in place, right? But for us, the problem is that we have alienated ourselves so much that I'm afraid that that intuitive sense is completely gone out of the window. So we need to, the question is, all the interconnections is an interesting point, because at least we need to begin to understand and appreciate the interconnection, so that any action you take, you know that there is a consequence to that action. You don't respond by saying this is the end. Like, you don't say that if I plant trees here, then I am going to address climate change. Afforestation is one way to address climate change. You don't do that. You know that afforestation is part of a series and a complex set of measures which is a response to climate change. So that's what I mean by interconnections. Yeah. Because it can paralyze you if sometimes it can paralyze decision making if you think, oh my God, I need to understand everything before I take it. So like, even for example, the choice of clothes we wear or the food we eat, if you have some sense of where it's coming from, you may make a different choice. Okay? You may choose to eat something else. You may choose to eat something more local than something that's imported. If you know that it's imported, but if you don't know, right? So that's what I mean by knowing and understanding some of these important
Take it next.
Thank you, Radha. This is Durga.
Yeah, Durga. Yes.
Yeah, my main question is, there is generally a long answer.
Yeah.
Because there is a there are so many connections that have to be thought about.
Correct.
Versus there are the short-term people who come up with quick fixes,
Yes.
and therefore, it's a losing battle, and you're very correct. Very. I mean, it's very good to hear that there is something called trade-off, and therefore,
Yes.
once there is trade-off, always there is a losing side, right?
Yes.
Because the economics will play a role and so on.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. Yes.
thank you.
Not at all. Thank you for that.
It reminds me of Polavaram Dam. I know.
Yes, it does.
It's linking of South Indian rivers, the big mighty Godavari with Krishna.
Yes.
So the absurd idea of connecting rivers must be dating back to the Britishers. So one engineer in the British colonial era thought of linking river, and that's how they unearthed the documentation.
Yeah. But also, we have, we are no better, right? I mean, we have a colonial legacy, and then we built on it rapidly and very aggressively too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, are there any other questions or reflections?
Naim is in an expansive mood. Oh, why not?
Yeah, so if there are no questions, I think we can call it a night. There is so much food for thought, so we can all achieve we can chew and churn for tomorrow's session.
Sure.
That's going to be our food web. And please do read the links which are there in the description of the event, and that is going to really help you to understand the food.
It'll be good actually, and also thank you so much, all of you. I mean, this was such terrific, sort of thoughts for discussion. I wouldn't call them questions. It's really all of us sharing our own concerns, and so thank you for making this very alive for me as well. So that's lovely.
Yeah.
Thanks. I look forward to tomorrow's conversation. Yeah.
No, it boils down to us at the end, no?
Exactly. At the end, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much for this very one.
Thank you. Thank you.
Patiently answering all the queries.
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah. It makes one think so much, right?
Yeah.
So then we'll meet again tomorrow, same place, same time.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Take care. Good night.
Yeah.
And thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Bye. Thank you everybody for joining.
Bye. Thanks. Bye.
चल रहा हूँ फिर
You unmute and speak to Nigh.